Obviously, Steve's not here. My name's Jeff. I'm one of the elders, and thanks for joining us today. Real quick, last week Steve introduced something that the elders are asking our church body to do, and that is this. Let me give a little background information. When we moved from our old location to this location, bought the land, built this building, the cost was a little more than $8 million. We've actually done probably about $1 million worth of upgrades, just adding a student wing as well as adding parking. The good news is the amount we still owe is down to about $2.7 million. And so that's good news. But here's what the elders are asking us to do is we as a church body, out of the generous heart that we have, is to give a free will offering to our building fund so that we can continue to make principal and interest payments over the next 10 to 11 months till a new campaign kicks in. And so this is not a manipulation. All it is for you, asking you to make a free will offering to our building fund. You can just do that on an envelope or your check. Just write building fund. We'll know where to put that. Thanks for that. So Nehemiah 7, that's where we're at. If you would turn in your phones or a Bible to Nehemiah chapter 7, and it really is important that you have this in front of you. We're going to have some of the verses on the screen, but I want you to see kind of the full scope of chapter 7 because we're not going to read all of it. And to get a sense for what's happening, you do kind of need to see it in print, and love for you to turn there. Now, up to this point in Nehemiah, we've seen Nehemiah who is just singularly focused on rebuilding the wall. And so last week we saw that the wall was completed. And I know kind of in my mind it's like, okay, Nehemiah's job is done. But surprise, surprise, God had a bigger plan than just simply rebuilding the wall. And he had a plan to use Nehemiah to do something bigger and better, if you will. And so we're going to see the start of that today in chapter 7. So chapter 7, we're going to begin at verse 1. And so Nehemiah is speaking, and he says this, "Now when the wall had been built," we saw that last week in chapter 6, "and I had set up the doors," in other words, finished this whole project, "and the gatekeepers and the singers and the Levites had been appointed." And we're just going to pause there for a second. And so Nehemiah says the wall's built, the doors are in, we're locked down, we're good. And then he says, I'm going to establish the gatekeepers, singers, and Levites. And I know because of the proximity here of gatekeepers to the doors, you know, they're very close, you would immediately think, okay, he's establishing gatekeepers for the gates in the wall. But really what we need to do is look at this entire section, this entire clause, and especially when you see gatekeepers, singers, and Levites together, who Nehemiah is referring to are actually the gatekeepers of the temple. The gatekeepers of the temple. And so what he's saying is, I've appointed those who are in charge of the temple, the gatekeepers. Those were obviously individuals who had to be very trustworthy. They were very alert. God was very specific on how the temple was to function, what they were supposed to do at what time. And so the guards were there to keep people out of areas they shouldn't be in, to guard the key utensils of worship. And so they were a very important part of temple worship, as were the singers, of course. The Levites were one of the main tribes, but they weren't allotted land. In fact, their portion was the temple in essence. And so when you see these gatekeepers, singers, and Levites, you'll see them together like that, and that just simply means that Nehemiah appointed them to serve in the temple. Most likely, even though the temple was reconstructed many years earlier, probably they had let that go down. And so Nehemiah needed to step up and reestablish what was happening at the temple. And here's kind of an important point. Jerusalem wasn't important because in of itself. It was important because this is where the temple was. Jerusalem is crucial. Why? Because this is where the temple is. There is one place that sinful man could meet the one true God, and that was the temple that was located in Jerusalem. Verse 2. "I gave my brother Hananiah, the governor of the castle, charge over Jerusalem, for he was more faithful and God-fearing than many." And so Nehemiah then establishes two administrators over the city. One of them was his brother Hananiah. And you say, well, that's probably not good. No, actually, it probably was good. Because when we first see Hananiah, it is at the very beginning of the book of Nehemiah. Let's go back there. Chapter 1, verse 2. So Hananiah, along with some other men, came to Nehemiah, and this is what it says. Hananiah, one of my brothers, came with certain men from Judah, and I asked them concerning the Jews who escaped, who had survived the exile, concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the remnant there in the province who had survived the exile is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. And so the person who initially brought Nehemiah the news about the state of affairs in Jerusalem was in fact his brother. And so we can see from this, his brother has a big heart for Jerusalem, very concerned about what God is doing there in the temple. And so what we assume is that Hananiah actually stuck with Nehemiah and was part of his leadership team to bring about the rebuilding of the wall. So he would have been kind of a natural leader for Jerusalem. As for the second guy, Hananiah, very similar name, but different person, he was a governor of the castle. And that's kind of strange, but what we read in chapter 2, verse 8, is that Nehemiah, when he was asking for supplies from the king, he asked specifically for timber to rebuild the fortress at the temple. You see, the Temple Mount was right at the edge of the north wall, and it was very vulnerable to attack. And so they built a fortress right there. And so that would be this castle. And so Hananiah was governor of the castle. He probably was a very important military man. But notice the characteristics that he had. Nehemiah points them out to us. He was faithful and God-fearing more than most. He was faithful and God-fearing. Now, if you've done a resume recently, I'm not sure if any of us have ever put faithful on it, right? We're happy to write creative, innovative, all these kind of catch terms, but faithful, that seems a bit passé. That seems like old-fashioned. We refer to our dogs as faithful. But this is key to this individual and his qualifications for leadership. And, of course, we could ask, is being faithful important to God? Yes, of course we know. We know he's faithful, and faithfulness is the fruit of the Spirit. That's something God does in us and through us as we yield and believe in him. So yes, being faithful is important. In the past 2 weeks, we've talked about the importance of fearing God. Last week in particular, we looked at how fear is an opponent. It is something that we're going to have to overcome. No matter what your next is, you're going to have to overcome fear. And the way you do that, of course, is fearing the one whom we should fear, who is God himself. And so Nehemiah appoints these two individuals as administrators over Jerusalem. Look at verse 3. And so he said to them, again, Hananiah and Hananiah, let not the gates of Jerusalem be opened until the sun is hot. And while they are still standing guard, let them shut and bar the doors. Appoint guards from among the inhabitants of Jerusalem, some at their guard posts and some in front of their own homes. And so Nehemiah very specifically gives them two directions. One of them is make sure the gates function properly. Make sure the gates function properly. This is not a revolving door. It's not a screen door. This is a real gate that needs to prevent some people from coming in. It must function properly. And so the directions he gives them are simple and they seem very obvious. But I think he had to give it to them because he knew this could be a downfall for Jerusalem. And the first one is make sure you don't open them till the sun gets hot. In other words, don't open them in the early morning when maybe there's fog on the ground and the enemy could hide out. Don't open it when the sun could be behind them and you might not see the activity of the enemy. Make sure it's all clear and you have good lines of sight before you open the gates. And the second thing he says is when you shut the door, make sure you lock it, bolt it, right? How many of you have family members who just love to shut things and don't lock it, right? Yeah, we've all been there. And so his advice is very straightforward. Make sure you don't open it too early. Make sure when you shut it, lock it. Very clear. And then here's what really is surprising, verse 4. The city was wide and large. We've just seen 6 chapters devoted to building the wall, but the people within it were few, and no houses had been rebuilt. That's just very surprising to me, that that once they built the walls, then they look inside, there's not many people inside. And in fact, the homes haven't been rebuilt. Remember, when the Babylonians came, they devastated Jerusalem, and they took all of the people away, or they killed them. They ransacked the city. Nothing was left. All that was left now was a rebuilt temple. And so Nehemiah is looking out and seeing this. And so it really sets the stage for what God has for him next. But let me just make a few observations. The first one is this. Obviously, walls are important. Those are a means of protection. But a wall is no good if the gates don't function properly, right? Walls are no good if you don't, in fact, have gatekeepers, those who keep the gates. And walls are no good if you don't really have watchmen who are watching over them. That's why previously Nehemiah said, hey, make sure you put people at certain spots on the wall and go ahead and put them in front of their own house. That way they'll really pay attention. And finally this, a wall is no good if you don't have a vibrant city within. If it's not vibrant, if you don't have the numbers and the strength and the unity, an invader will be able to overcome a wall. You need all of this. And so this is now Nehemiah's project, to build up Jerusalem. Why? Because this is where the temple is. All of this is serving as a protection for the one true place people could meet with God. Verse 5. So he says, then, in light of all that we just said, in light of Jerusalem being devastated, my God put it into my heart to assemble the nobles and the officials and the people to be enrolled by genealogy. And I found the book of the genealogy of those who came up at the first, and I found written in it. Okay, so we're just going to have to backtrack a little bit to kind of put this all together. I think one of the keys here is that Nehemiah says that God put it into his heart. This is something that God wanted to do. And I think it's important because it contrasts what happened to David. Remember King David? He decided he was going to number the people of the kingdom. The problem was, it says that Satan prompted him to do that. And so Nehemiah is saying, hey, I'm not like David. This is something that God wanted me to do. I needed to figure out who's here and who's not. And so it's not so much an issue of counting people, it's making sure that the people counted. He wanted to make sure that the genealogy lists were intact, that he knew that these were true Jews who were here. He wanted to know who was supposed to be in the city so that he could tell those who were not in the city, hey, you're supposed to be in Jerusalem, let's build it up. And I think to convince others to come to Jerusalem to make sure it's a vibrant city, because the more vibrant it is, the better protection it is over the temple. And so he decides to pull all of the leaders together to get a good head count, and then they find this book of genealogy. Very fascinating. So it's a book of the people who had come about 100 years earlier to the Promised Land. And to really set the stage, let me give you a little diagram that's really helped me through the years kind of summarize the nation of Israel's history. And so when the nation of Israel began as kind of if you would call it a united kingdom, that was under King Saul. And so there was Saul, there was David, and then there was Solomon. And so they were the kings, but that didn't last very long, because in about 931 BC, this united kingdom actually got split into two kingdoms. There was the north kingdom and the south kingdom. The north kingdom was called Israel. And this is where it gets a little confusing, because the united kingdom was also called Israel. The south kingdom was called Judah. There were 10 tribes in the north. There were 2 tribes in the south. The capital of Israel was Samaria. The capital of Judah, of course, was Jerusalem. And why that's important, of course, is this is where the temple is. And so this northern kingdom, which is now Israel, it lasted for a while, but they didn't follow God. They served other gods. They worshiped other gods. In about 722 BC, God used the Assyrians as a tool of his judgment and devastated Israel. the 10 northern tribes. And for the most part, they never came back. I know there's that phrase, the 10 lost tribes of Israel. That's not really a biblical term because there were some remnants that were here and there. But for the most part, that nation never recovered. Why? Because of God's judgment. Now, the southern kingdom actually survived that. They had some good kings, some bad kings. But eventually, they as well sinned to such an extent that beginning in 605 BC, God sent the Babylonians as a tool of judgment, and they began taking Judah in captivity. And for 70 years, they were in captivity in Babylon. They devastated Jerusalem, brought it to the ground. And then, because of God's promise, these exiles started coming back from Babylon. The first group, which was under Zerubbabel. I say that fast 5 times. Zerubbabel. Not easy if you got a tongue like mine. So under Zerubbabel, which was about 530-ish BC, he brought back that first remnant, and they began rebuilding the temple. A little bit later, we see Ezra come back, and that was around 455, and then about 445, as we learned last week, here comes Nehemiah back. And so Zerubbabel here, this guy, he rebuilt the temple, and they took a log and rewrote down everyone who came back. And so this list is actually in Ezra chapter 2, and it's the same list that's repeated, surprisingly, in Nehemiah chapter 7. But what is so interesting here, that God would take the people and he would judge them for 70 years, but he had promised earlier, before he even sent them in captivity, that he would bring them back to Judah. So let's see what that promise was in Jeremiah 29. For thus says the Lord, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will visit you. Notice, and I will fulfill to you my promise and bring you back to this place. Continuing on. I will be found by you, declares the Lord, and I will restore your fortunes and gather you from all the nations and all of the places where I have driven you, declares the Lord, and I will bring you back to the place from which I sent you into exile. Notice, it looked bad, but this was God. These were his covenant people. He says, I'm judging you for now because of your sin. I'm going to put you in captivity, but I'm going to bring you back to Judah. This is all very important. Why? Because Judah is the lineage of the king and the line of David. And who is in the line of David? The Messiah. This all fits together and very crucial. Is the reason why I believe God has kept it and recorded it for us. Look at verse 6. So this is actually the book of genealogy that was 100 years earlier. These were the people of the province who came up out of the captivity of those exiles, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried into exile. They returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each to his own town. Even there, you see the faithfulness of people who for a couple generations had lived in Babylon, but they knew God's promise, and so they traveled over dangerous lands in order to come back to the promised land. Verse 7. They came with Zerubbabel, Jeshua, Nehemiah, Azariah, Raamiah, Nahamani, Mordecai, Bilshan, Misprith, Bigvai, Naham, and Baana, the number of the men of the people of Israel. And then they begin to number them. The sons of Perosh, 2,172. The sons of Shephatiah, 372. The sons of Ara, 652. The sons of Pahath Moab, namely the sons of Jeshua and Joab, 2,818. And on it goes. We're not going to read all of those names. Number one, you don't want me reading them. We know that. I'm sweating right now just going through that small list. And I even practiced. Why would God include this list of names? And why would he include it twice in Ezra 2 and Nehemiah 7? Well, we don't know maybe the exact answer. I know this. God's people are important to God. God's covenant people are important to him. He knows them by name. He lists them by name. He records them by name. God's people are important to God. He delights in them. And here is this group of exiles. They are actually part of the promise. He said, I will bring you back. And here's their names to prove that God is faithful. But also this, as we already talked about, the Messiah, who's going to come about 450 years later, guess what? The Messiah needs to prove his genealogy. You go to the book of Matthew and the book of Luke, and you'll see they, in fact, prove it, that the Messiah was in the line of Judah, in particular, the line of David. And so once the Messiah comes, you don't need these records of genealogy. But till that point, when the Messiah came, you did need them. And so let me just pause for a second. So the big picture of chapter 7 is this. Chapters 1 through 6 is all about Nehemiah reestablishing the physical wall, protecting Jerusalem, which then protects the temple. Chapters 8 through 13 really is all about the restoration of the people spiritually. And this chapter 7 is kind of a pivot point, because what Nehemiah now sees is that God's put into his heart to do the two things: repopulate the city. Why? In order to properly provide and protect the temple. Now, we're going to jump down to verse 63, because there is a group of people, and it's too bad, so sad, but here it goes. Also of the priests, the sons of Hobiah, the sons of Hakaz, the sons of Barzillai, who had taken a wife of the daughters of Barzillai, the Gileadite, and was called by their name. These sought their registration among those enrolled in the genealogies, but it was not found there, so they were excluded. They were excluded. They had made the trek from Babylon to Jerusalem, but because they could not prove who they were excluded from the priesthood as unclean. The governor told them that they were not to partake of the most holy food until a priest with Urim and Thummim should arise. In other words, until a spiritual judgment came. But as far as we know, they were left out in the cold. Why? Because you needed to prove you were in fact part of the line. This was important to prove that you were part of the covenant. So in light of this, in light of the importance of the temple, and in light of the importance of those who serve in the temple, I do want to look real quick at its kind of overall purpose by way of reminder. So in the Promised Land, when the Jews met with God, it was in the tabernacle. And then David wanted to build God a temple. And then Nathan comes to him with words from God, and this is what Nathan says in 1 Chronicles 17. He's talking to David. When your days are fulfilled to walk with your fathers, i.e., you're done, you die, I will raise up your offspring after you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom, Solomon. He shall build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever, a house. And so here God is referring to a place where he can manifest his glory. The temple is a house for none other than God himself. 2 Chronicles 7, so Solomon builds the temple. On the day of dedication, this is what happens. As soon as Solomon had finished his prayer of dedication, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices. And the glory of the Lord filled the temple, and the priests could not enter the house of the Lord. Why? Because the glory of the Lord filled the Lord's house. And when all of the people saw Israel, when all of the people of Israel saw the fire come down and the glory of the Lord on the temple, they bowed down with their faces to the ground on the pavement, and they worshiped and gave thanks to the Lord, saying, "For he is good, his steadfast love endures forever." You see, God's temple was a place where he designed it so that sinful man could meet with the holy God, and he designed it in particular in finest details to indicate the means by which we as sinners can approach God. He designed all of the sacrifice and especially the atonement for sin in a very particular way. Why? Because it needed to be done this way. And so the temple is in fact a place where sinful people can meet God. It's a place of sacrifice. It's a place for atonement of sin. It's a place where we can know God, love God, and treasure God. Okay, now, but that temple's gone, right? It's gone. It got wiped out in 70 AD and has never been rebuilt. So what happened to the temple? Let's look at now, especially as it applies to us. Paul is writing to the Ephesians, and this is after the death of Christ, and he says this: "In him," that is the Messiah, Jesus the Christ, The whole building is joined together and rises to become a holy temple in the Lord. And in him, you too are being built together to become a dwelling in which God lives by his Spirit. And so the church is now the temple. Why? Because God is manifesting his presence through his Spirit. He is building up the church to be a holy temple. Notice what Paul says in a very similar fashion in 1 Corinthians. Don't you know that you yourselves, again, he's talking to the church, you yourselves are God's temple, and God's Spirit dwells in your midst. If anyone destroys God's temple, heads up, God will destroy that person. For God's temple is sacred, and you together are that temple. And finally, let me read one more verse. 1 Corinthians 5, Paul says this, what business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. Expel the wicked person from among you. Okay, here's what we get from that last verse. Paul clearly indicates that there are those who are inside the church and outside, right? He says, don't judge those who are outside. Make sure you only judge those who are inside. There's a part of it here that there's a very clean line between those who are out and those who are in. Now, that's not a wall per se, but there is some clear line between those who are in and those who are out. So if we were to draw a diagram of the church, we would say this. There's our walls around us. There are walls around us, and there's a gate. And the gate allows certain people to come in. And there are gatekeepers who oversee the gate. Now, these gatekeepers are actually elders. This is part of an elder who governs over the church, is they allow certain people in. And God is very clear who we are to allow into the church. And today we call that membership. Now, membership comes from the metaphor of an organic body. But here we're going to use it. So the gate is, in fact, membership. So what the elders are doing is we have a meeting time where those who would like to become members of Sherman Bible, they come, and then the elders actually have mature people who do kind of an interview. In this interview, what the person is listening for are three things. One, we want to hear the person explain the gospel in simple terms, and then say this, and testify that they have in fact repented and believed in Jesus, their testimony, their story. And we want to see fruit of that, namely baptism, because Jesus has commanded us to be baptized. And so this is a gate into the church. And it's a very important gate. And so the elders, part of their function as governors is to make sure that this gate functions properly, that it's not open when it shouldn't be open, that in fact it closes at certain points, that it only allows in those who are in fact in, those who give testimony that Jesus is the Christ. And so what about the rest of us? What's our job? All of us, as now that we're members, what do? We just party and have fun and play games. That's what we do. No, what we do is this, is number one, we build up the church. Remember what Nehemiah is trying to do. He's trying to build up the city. Why? Because that strength there. The wall is no good if you got no one on the inside. The line defining in and out does no good if we're not on the inside strong. What does that mean, strong? That means we believe. We believe in God. We fear God. So we build each other up. Second, as we've been learning, we put on the armor. We also are on watch. All of us are on watch. We're watching for who? We're watching for the schemes of the evil one. We're watching for sin. We're watching for false teachers. That's all of our job together. This is what's going to make the church strong. Nehemiah was working hard, laboring to build up Jerusalem. Why? To protect the temple. We now, because we are the temple, we've got to build up. We got to make sure we got walls up. We got to make sure the gates are functioning properly. We've got to make sure that we are strong, i.e., we believe in the gospel. Because without the wall, without the gates, without the gatekeepers, without the strong and dwellers within the walls, there really is no wall. And so we really see here, just as Nehemiah built up Jerusalem, we need to build up the church. And of course, how do we build it up? Well, there's nothing you and I can do in of ourselves. The gospel is what builds us up. It's what gave birth to the church. It is what makes us strong. And so the church itself is unlike any other organization on the planet. You know why? All these other organizations man devised. The church is God's idea. It is God's idea. God says, this is my group of people, this is my church, this is who you are, this is what you are to do, and this is how you organize. That's why we don't look like any other organization. Why? Because God is uniquely told us as a church who we are and what we are to do. We are to manifest the glory of God. We are the dwelling of the Holy Spirit. We have a very unique mission, a mandate, and that is simply to proclaim the gospel. No one else has been given that. We are to proclaim the gospel. And so, very uniquely, within the church, this gospel gets visualized, like we saw in the video, with people being baptized, and a bit later when we go through communion and participate in that. Again, a visualization of what? The gospel. Now, let's talk a minute about doctrine, because Jesus and Paul give us two very similar warnings. And again, this talks about the walls of the church, how we are to defend ourselves. Jesus says this, "Watch out for false prophets. They come in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves." Now, why would they dress up like a sheep? Because they want to get through the gate. They want to deceive us. Because if we saw a wolf coming, we would close the gate. And so this is the importance of gatekeepers and all of us being on watch. Notice what Paul says. "I know that after I leave, savage wolves will come in among you and will not spare the flock." I know that maybe we don't right now fear a wolf who's going to come in here and cause physical damage to us, but we do fear false teaching and false doctrine and false gospels. They can do so much damage. God says so, and so we watch out for them. And so in light of that, I want to do this. Okay, let me go back to this drawing. Okay, we have the church, right? And you've got the world. Okay, what does the world want? What does the world want? Let me put it to you this way. This is what the world wants. The world wants us as a church to get rid of our gate. The church wants no gate. It wants to be able to come into the church anytime it wants. In fact, it would prefer there's no walls at all. This is the scheme of the evil one. Remove the walls, remove the gates. You say, well, how do you know that? Well, let's talk about membership. Membership, especially in our society, is so devalued. You hear so much against church membership. You know where that comes from? That comes from the world. Why? The world doesn't want that division. It doesn't want us to be uniquely God's. It wants us to be part of them. And so it's removing the gates. It wants a wide open gate. And in fact, it doesn't want any walls to separate us. That's why when it comes to teaching, the world wants to tell us what the gospel means. It wants us to assume the gospel. It doesn't want us to proclaim the gospel. It wants us to confuse law and gospel. It wants us sometimes to get rid of law. It wants us sometimes to get rid of gospel. It is constantly putting that pressure on us. When it comes to worship, it's not worried about truth. It, in fact, wants us to value art over the truth of the lyrics. When it comes to community, it doesn't want gates. It doesn't want walls. Why? Because it wants the wolves to be in our D groups. It wants the wolves to be part of us. It doesn't want us to properly administer baptism or communion. And you see it really clear when it comes to mission. The world wants the church to divest, if you will. Instead of being so focused on gospel proclamation, it wants us to do everything else. If I've heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times. This statement, well, if the church did what it's supposed to do, there'd be no poverty. You know what the world's doing? The world is telling the church, forget about the gospel. Here's what you need to do. That is so dangerous. When we remove the boundaries, the world begins to tell us, here's your mission. Do this, do that, do this, do that. And all of a sudden, the gospel's left behind. This is very dangerous. This is why we as a church are on repeat. Sherman Bible Church exists to glorify God by making disciples of Jesus Christ through gospel-centered teaching, gospel-centered worship, gospel-centered community, and gospel-centered mission. Here's what I'd like to do. I would like to conclude by telling the rest of the story. 2 weeks ago, I did a little diagram. And today, what I want to do is tell you the rest of the story. We had 2 weeks ago talked about how God is all glorious. He is righteous, just, and because we are sinful, guess what we deserve? Wrath. We deserve God's wrath because He is righteous and He is just. We deserve wrath. But God, in His own time, in His own plan, sent forth His Son. And so Jesus then, even though He looked very weak on the cross, it was very shameful death. And in fact, they mocked Him. There were people who said, look at you. You said you were going to destroy the temple and raise it again in 3 days. Save yourself. Now, why would they say something like that? Why were they mocking Him? Let's go back to John chapter 2. In John chapter 2, Jesus had gone into the temple and He had thrown out the money changers and those who were selling sacrificial animals. And the Jews then responded to Him like, what sign do you show us to prove your authority to do all this? In other words, yes, we're guilty. We're not going to talk about the issue. Let's talk about another issue, and that is, where did you get your authority? And Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. They replied, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you're going to raise it in 3 days? But the temple He had spoken of was His body. The temple He had spoken of was His body. And after He was raised from the dead, His disciples recalled what He had said, and they believed the Scripture and the words that Jesus had spoken. Last week, we talked about, or 2 weeks ago, that the place where you and I, where we meet God, is in the shadow of the cross. Okay, that's a metaphor. It's appropriate. But now, here is the deeper understanding. Here is where sinful people meet God. Here is the place of sacrifice. Here is the place for atonement of sin. What does that sound like? Does that not sound like the temple? Does that sound like Jesus? Jesus says, I will destroy this temple, i.e., not only the physical temple, it's gone, but I will destroy my body and raise it up. No one takes my life from me. I do this. He sacrificed Himself. And so now we as a church, we are in the shadow of the cross, but here's where we're at. We're in the temple. It's not a physical location, it's a person. God says, I will take a group of people and I will call them chosen. I will call them a holy nation. I will call them a royal priesthood, a people from my own possession. And He says, I will meet with them in my temple, i.e., I will meet with them in my Son, who died for their sin and rose from the dead. We now meet with God in the temple. That temple is the broken body of Jesus who has died and raised again. And that's why Paul in 1 Corinthians 3, he says this, we preach Christ, but you know what he says after that? We preach Christ what? Crucified. We preach Christ crucified. There are churches who are preaching Christ, but if they don't preach Christ crucified, it's not the gospel. You see, we can only come to God on His terms, and we come to the temple. How so? Because Jesus, as our high priest, was a perfect sacrifice, and now He has made atonement for sin such that we, as a church, can meet with God. And here's even what's crazier. Now we, as a church, as a community, are referred to as a temple. Jesus is the ultimate temple, but we function as a temple. How so? This is the place that people can meet with God, not because we are making a sacrifice. We don't make the sacrifice for sins. What do? We simply proclaim it. we not only proclaim it to one another, we proclaim it to the nations. And so, yes, we function as a temple. The only way we can function as a temple is because Jesus is the ultimate temple. Praise God for what he has provided for us through his Son, Jesus Christ. Here's what we're going to do. Those who are going to serve communion, I'd love for you to come up and begin serving. The band's going to come up as well. But after we've just talked about the broken body of Jesus and that it is the temple, isn't no wonder that Paul gives us this warning when we're about to participate in communion when he says, "Whoever therefore eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty concerning the body and the blood of the Lord." Ladies and gentlemen, please be careful. If you, in fact, have not repented and believe in Jesus, just let the elements pass. And for all the rest of us, make sure we're judging ourselves. We don't treat this lightly. We are entering into the temple, not a physical location, but into a person who has died and rose again on our behalf. If you hold the elements in just a moment, we will together take them.